there's a logic to the evolution of money.
Yeah.
From why we went from gold to receipts for gold, and those receipts for gold becoming the notes that we use, and you can understand. I can even understand why governments decided to bring in central banks. Governments themselves are a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies by design grow. They're a beast that continues to grow, and it continues to think it has to interfere with all parts of our lives. And so if you have bank failures, well, let's stop bank failures. Let's have central,
exactly.
So let's have central banks, stop runs on the banks. Okay, so that's why we have a central bank. And let's have FDIC programs. Let's have whatever the equivalent we have in the UK. And all these things make sense, but it is just this ever-growing beast that's trying to protect us from. It's almost like, who is it? Dan Taub has said governments essentially become insurance providers for anything.
Oh, I saw that. Yeah. This is just a couple of weeks ago, right?
Well, it was the previous one. I think he did.
Yeah, we recorded 2, so that would have been in sort of September time, I think, last year.
Oh, okay. I haven't seen that one.
Yeah. And
he mentioned it again on the most recent one.
He just said, look, essentially since World War II, we've become insurance providers, and governments are trying to do everything they can to ensure the system and the individuals are protected in every scenario, and trying to make things fairer. But the way they do things, actually, they kind of make things unfair because of the incentives of the system. But like I said, I can understand every step that's been taken to bring us where we are. And I think at some point in the future, there'll be this history of time, and there'll be the gold era, and then the fiat era, and then the Bitcoin. I get all that. But at the same time, it's good to understand why fiat has failed. Like what are the inherent, like you said, systemic issues that mean it can't work in a fair way?
Oh, I can tie this really nicely to the book, but in like a probably hilariously cryptic way that you're going to have to unpack.
Okay.
It forces you to misprice capital. That is the worst. There are other issues. I'd say probably a close second would be it manipulates people's time preference artificially, and that has other knock-on effects, which we also talk about in the book, just much later on in a slightly different context. But I think by far the worst issue is that it incentivizes, if not causes, mandates to some extent that capital is misallocated.
That's what Stephen Lubka talked to us about, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, he loves this.
Well, he talked about 0% interest rates in that. It misprices capital.
Or negative interest rates.
I'm still never going to be able to get my head around that.
Well, there's a fairly easy way of explaining why that's stupid, like why it's just mind-blowingly stupid. You're, as a recipient of a negative interest rate loan, let's say, or really just any form of financing, you are being paid to destroy value.
Yes.
You can profit whilst making a loss, and that's as clear. If you want a kind of a more mechanical, I appreciate that. Me saying things like misallocate capital to a lot of people, that would just be jargon that doesn't mean anything to them. But that's an example.
Well, I think it's a prime example of something definitely broken.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about this mispricing of capital. What are the systemic issues with fiat that causes capital to be mispriced?
Essentially, that capital itself is scarce. All real goods and time is scarce. And fiat money is not. And any money, fiat or otherwise, gold, Bitcoin, whatever, is not itself wealth. It's claims on wealth. And so if you can, as is not only as happens, but is kind of the point of fiat, create more claims on wealth at no cost whatsoever, then you are going to trick people into thinking there is a lot more wealth than there really is, because they only see the claims and they have no way of knowing that they're essentially fraudulent, and acting essentially foolishly, I guess. You're making, this is obviously linked to the point about time preference too, making decisions that do not line up with the state of economic reality. And then the kind of the fancier, more jargony way of framing that is saying misallocating capital. I could probably dig into that just a little bit more. What that really means is making plans around basically businesses. That's kind of an oversimplification, but it's maybe good enough for now. Making plans about businesses that assume prices of both the supplies for that business and the products of that business that are in no, even if they're accurate now, they may not be accurate now at all, but even if they are accurate now, they're in no way sustainable. So it's encouraging people to put time and effort into enterprises that will not last in the long run. That's capital misallocation. That's probably a decently concise explanation.
And can you give me real world examples?
The exact problem is that you can't know in the moment. Like this is why it's kind of a tricky, almost elusive concept, that the problem itself is people acting as if this information they're getting from the market is true, is accurate. And there's not really any way of adjusting for that. You can't, look at prices as they are now and perform a fiat adjustment. I don't know, like, oh, well, what would these prices really be if and when we get the banking collapse that's due, and then I'll build that business instead? Like, that just doesn't make any sense. So, okay, it's a really interesting question, but I actually think that precisely why you can't answer it is almost the point of what the problem is here.
Well, so as a more direct example of something that I've been kind of intrigued by as like an example, like Twitter was bought by Elon Musk for $44 billion.
Mm-hmm.
It has to pay back interest, I think about $1 billion a year.
Mm-hmm.
I can't exactly remember what their revenue.
I have no idea.
Revenue is, but I was thinking it through, and I was looking at the share price. A lot of people have got fabulously wealthy off Twitter, way beyond any amount of actual revenue it's generated.
About 3 billion.
So about 3 billion is its revenue.
Mm-hmm.
How much profit? Because that's the money that should be distributed to people. I mean, revenue can pay wages, but it feels like there's companies in the tech sector that have generated way more money for investors than have ever been generated or may ever be generated.
Okay, sure. That's a good example. So there's a slight tweak in that answer, which I think makes it a lot easier to address, which is that I got a bit nervous when you said Twitter specifically, because I was getting prepared to be like, I know absolutely nothing about them. And, even if I did, who am I to say kind of thing. But there's always a component of that too, right? Yeah. That this is kind of the magic of markets in the first place, that you should always be saying, who am I to say? Unless you're putting yourself forward as the central planner of the price of capital, which is that's what a central bank is, and that's why we're in this problem in the first place. But the tweak that you made there, which I liked, and I think opens up a really fruitful avenue for discussion, is just moving away from a single company and looking at, if not an industry, an entire pattern of capital allocation. You mentioned the tech sector. I'd maybe even go a bit broader than that. You could stretch that to most US-based venture capital since the financial crisis.
Yeah, that's fair.
And this actually links interestingly to what you're asking about my previous employer, because there's a few steps involved to get there, but I'll go over them hopefully pretty quickly. If the pension funds, who typically are the end clients of all of this, well, they're members or the real beneficiaries, but as an institution, it tends to be pension funds. If the pension funds are increasingly having to think about, for example, inflation, what that means for them is that their liabilities in the future are growing. Typically, there's kind of mechanics of exactly how pension funds work that's not worth getting into, but by and large, it means that their liabilities in the future are growing. It means they have to pay their to-be pensioners more, which makes sense, right? Things are going to cost more when these people retire. If they're worried about that, probably two things are going to happen at the same time. So one is that, or one of them may already be happening, but the one that's already happening is that they're worried about inflation in the first place. Assume they're right? They're not just like paranoid. They're worried about inflation because of all this money printing. That's very likely manifesting at least first in financial markets, and then eventually in regular goods, that just because of the mechanism of how most, quote unquote, money printing works, or has worked in the past 20 years or so. So the regular assets that they would be investing in have basically already taken on a kind of a monetary premium, right? Like they've become savings, but inflation still exists. It's still expected. It's actually, that is inflation, and that is a version of inflation. And so in order to meet these increasingly dire liabilities, they need to go further and further out the risk spectrum. They need to start investing in things that are very probably more and more, you could just, if you're being super cynical, you just say stupid, right? Like bad investment ideas. Dogecoin. I guess a fair, well, no, Dogecoin is just obvious. Like there's no doubt about that. But this is what's dangerous though, because I think the fairer interpretation would be just that they're riskier, or they're more and more uncertain, right? They have lower and lower reasonable likelihoods of massively outsized payoffs. I mean, maybe at a certain point, yeah, you do in fact get to Dogecoin. I think for retail, it's probably exactly what's happened. That would have been the last crypto bubble, was exactly this playing out. But that entire process, first of all, it feeds on itself, because when they do that, their only sane reaction to the prices of financial assets being monetized is to further monetize the prices of financial assets, so that this problem just keeps causing itself. But then also that's one that I think most people are like reasonably aware of. I mean, especially now, we've had this for like 15 years now, and it's just gotten ludicrous. And, you gave Twitter as an example. There are far funnier examples of absolutely insane venture investments that hundreds of millions of dollars have been wasted on billions, probably in some cases.
100 million into WorldCoin, I've just seen this week,
sure,
which is
that's a good example
obviously
too.
Going to fail.
Yes, that's an excellent example. That is that's pension funds chasing yield. I mean, it's going to be marketed as innovation and all that shit, but it's ultimately the cause of that is pension funds chasing yield. The more interesting thing, though, to me at least, I think the more under the surface, more intangible, more difficult to kind of get your hands on, is what, I don't want to say should they have invested in, because that again implies that I know, or maybe what would they have invested in? If capital had been priced properly, what actually productive things would they have done? And so this is what's an example of capital misallocation. All of this is an example of capital misallocation, because there's an opportunity cost to this. Is you can laugh at $100 million for WorldCoin, but that's $100 million that actual businesses won't, businesses that could conceivably have done something useful and generated a return won't get. And then just to bring it completely full circle, the more real scarce capital is destroyed in that way, the worse inflation is ultimately going to get, because it will inevitably cost more to make stuff that people actually want, because there's fewer resources going towards it. The resources are all being directed towards complete nonsense. And that's fiat.
Yeah.
It's fiat fuckery.